She stood abandoned at a snow-covered train station in a wedding dress waiting for a husband who never existed. When Sheriff Elias Turner finds mail-order bride Clara Whitmore freezing in the Colorado winter of 1885, neither expects that a cruel deception would lead to the most unexpected love story Frost Hollow had ever witnessed. Stay with me until the end of this tale of betrayal, redemption, and the slow thaw of frozen hearts. And please comment below which town you're watching from. I'd love to know how far Clara's story has traveled. The train's whistle cut through the winter air like a blade through silk, its mournful cry echoing across the snow-laden valley of Frost Hollow, Colorado. February 1885 had been particularly cruel that year, burying the mining town under 3 feet of snow that refused to melt, as if nature itself had decided to preserve the place in ice like some forgotten memory. Clara Whitmore pressed her face against the frosted window one last time as the locomotive shuddered to a halt, her breath creating small clouds that briefly obscured her view before dissipating into nothing. She had memorized every word of his letters during the 3-day journey from Philadelphia, each promise, each endearment, each carefully penned description of the life that awaited her. Theodore Morrison. Even his name had sounded solid, dependable, like something she could build a future upon. "End of the line, miss," the conductor announced, his voice carrying a note of finality that made her stomach tighten. He glanced at her wedding dress, ivory silk now wrinkled from days of travel, the delicate lace at the collar slightly yellowed from age, and something flickered across his weathered face. Pity, perhaps? Or maybe just the weariness of a man who had seen too many hopeful souls step off his train into disappointment. Clara gathered her courage along with her single suitcase, the leather worn soft from her mother's years of use. Inside lay everything she owned, 2 everyday dresses. Her mother's Bible, a silver hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother, and the packet of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Letters that had promised her everything and might yet deliver nothing. The platform stretched before her like a stage set for tragedy. Snow had been cleared in haphazard paths, creating walls of white that channeled foot traffic like a maze. A few curious faces peered at her from beneath heavy wool scarves and fur-lined hoods. She searched among them for Theodore's face, the strong jaw he'd described, the kind eyes he'd sworn would recognize her instantly. "You must be the bride," an elderly woman observed approaching with the confident gait of someone accustomed to inserting herself into other people's business. Her name, Clara would later learn, was Mrs. Prudence Hawthorne, the town's self-appointed keeper of morals and spreading of gossip. Morrison's bride from back east. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The cold had already begun seeping through her thin traveling boots, numbing her toes. "I'm Clara Whitmore, soon to be Morrison. Has there been any word?" Mrs. Hawthorne's expression shifted, her thin lips pressing together in a line that spelled trouble. "Child, there ain't no Theodore Morrison in Frost Hollow. Never has been." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, her free hand reaching out to steady herself against a frost-covered pillar. "But the letters, the money he sent for passage. When did these letters start arriving?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. 4 months ago, October. Clara fumbled with her suitcase, pulling out the packet of letters, as if they could defend themselves against this impossible accusation. "Look, here's his photograph." Mrs. Hawthorne barely glanced at the image, a handsome man with dark hair and a confident smile. "Could be anybody, dear. We get all sorts passing through here, what with the silver mines and all. Men looking for quick money, quicker exits." The crowd on the platform had grown drawn by the spectacle of the abandoned bride in her wedding dress. Clara heard whispers cascading through the gathering like water over rocks. "Mail-order bride. Foolish girl. Should have known better." "Mrs. Hawthorne?" A deep voice cut through the murmurs like an axe through wood. "That's enough entertainment for one afternoon." The crowd parted, and Clara found herself looking at a man who seemed carved from the very mountains that surrounded Frost Hollow. Sheriff Elias Turner stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders draped in a black wool coat that had seen better decades. His face was all sharp angles and shadows weathered by wind and loss, with eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant. A silver star pinned to his chest caught what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. "Sheriff," Mrs. Hawthorne straightened her gossipy demeanor, shifting to something more respectful, tinged with fear. I was just explaining to this poor child. I heard. His gaze moved to Clara, and she felt the weight of his assessment, not unkind, but measured as if he were cataloging her potential for trouble. Miss Whitmore, is it? She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The cold had spread from her feet up through her legs, and she wondered distantly if a person could freeze to death from the inside out, starting with their hopes. There's no Theodore Morrison registered in this county, he said, his voice carrying neither judgment nor sympathy, just fact. The postmaster Samuel mentioned someone had been collecting mail under that name for the past few months. Paid him extra to keep quiet about it. Man matching your photograph left on yesterday's eastbound train. The last of Clara's strength seemed to leave with her visible breath in the cold air. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if the sheriff hadn't moved with surprising speed, his strong hand catching her elbow. Steady now, he said quietly, and for a moment his professional detachment cracked, revealing something almost human underneath. I have nowhere to go. Clara whispered the words, escaping before she could stop them. I spent everything on the passage. My position in Philadelphia, they've already filled it. I have $16 to my name. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity sharpening into something hungrier. Clara recognized the look, the same one she'd seen in Philadelphia society, when someone's misfortune provided adequate entertainment for an afternoon's tea. $16 won't last you 3 days at the boarding house, someone called out. Not in winter when rooms are scarce. Could work at the saloon, another voice suggested with a snicker. Big Tom's always looking for pretty girls to serve drinks. That's enough. The sheriff's voice carried absolute authority. He released Clara's elbow, but remained close enough that his presence served as a barrier between her and the crowd. Everyone has business elsewhere, I'm certain. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, like theatrical patrons forced to leave before the final act. Mrs. Hawthorne lingered longest, her eyes bright with the promise of spreading this tale to every household in Frost Hollow before supper. Mrs. Hawthorne, the sheriff said pointedly, your husband will be wondering about his noon meal. She huffed, but retreated, her boots crunching against the packed snow as she hurried away, no doubt to begin her storytelling tour. Clara and the sheriff stood alone on the platform, the silence between them filled only by the sound of wind whistling through the telegraph wires. She became acutely aware of how she must look, a ridiculous figure in a wedding dress and summer boots standing in a snowbank like some Gothic novel's tragic heroine. Thank you, she managed, though the words felt inadequate. I'll figure something out. The next train east doesn't come for 3 days, he said, studying her with those pale eyes. And that's assuming the tracks stay clear. Storm's coming in tonight. As if to emphasize his point, the wind picked up, sending spirals of snow dancing across the platform. Clara shivered violently, her thin dress offering no protection against the Colorado winter. The sheriff sighed, a sound that seemed pulled from somewhere deep in his chest. My house is a 1/4 mile from here. You can warm up, have a meal. Figure out your next move without freezing to death. I couldn't possibly... It's not charity, he interrupted, his tone suggesting he found the very word distasteful. It's common sense. Can't have you dying on my watch. Creates paperwork. Despite everything, Clara felt the tiniest smile tug at her lips. Wouldn't want to inconvenience you with paperwork. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she could find humor in her situation. Come on then, before we both freeze. He picked up her suitcase without asking, and Clara found herself following him down the platform steps and into the main street of Frost Hollow. The town spread before them like a child's snow globe, quaint storefronts with painted signs, horses tied to posts, their breath steaming in the cold mountains rising on all sides like ancient sentinels. It's actually rather pretty, Clara observed, trying to see past her circumstances to the reality of the place. Pretty enough, I suppose, the sheriff replied without looking back. Until you've lived through 5 winters, then it's just cold. They walked in silence, Clara struggling to keep up with his long strides while navigating the icy patches in her impractical boots. Once she slipped and his hand shot out to steady her again, this time lingering a moment longer than necessary before pulling away. Those boots won't last a week here, he observed. They weren't meant to, Clara replied. They were meant for a wedding. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of her humiliation. The sheriff said nothing, but his pace slowed slightly, allowing her to walk with more dignity. His house sat at the edge of town, a two-story structure of weathered wood and stone that looked as if it had grown from the mountain itself rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth within. A swing hung from the porch, still and frozen like a memory, suspended in time. The sheriff paused at the front door, his hand on the handle. "My daughter is inside. Annie. She's 8. She's quiet. Doesn't take well to strangers." "I understand," Clara said, though she wondered what had made a child so young already wary of the world. The door opened into warmth that hit Clara like a physical embrace. She nearly sobbed from the relief of it, feeling sensation return painfully to her frozen extremities. The interior was sparse but clean, functional furniture. A few photographs on the mantel, everything in shades of brown and gray, as if color had been deemed frivolous and banished. "Annie," the sheriff called out, his voice gentler than Clara had heard it. "We have a visitor." A small figure appeared in the doorway to what must have been the kitchen. Annie Turner was a miniature ghost, pale skin, wheat-colored hair, pulled back in a severe braid, and her father's winter sky eyes. She wore a plain gray dress that made her look older than her 8 years, or perhaps it was the solemnity in her expression that aged her. "This is Miss Whitmore," the sheriff said. "She'll be warming up for a bit." Annie's gaze traveled from Clara's face to her wedding dress, lingering on the delicate beadwork at the waist. Something flickered across the child's features. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of something she'd seen before in happier times. "Are you getting married?" Annie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara's throat tightened. "I thought I was, but plans have changed." "Plans do that sometimes," Annie said, with a wisdom that no 8-year-old should possess. She turned and disappeared back into the kitchen without another word. "She hasn't been the same since—" The sheriff stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Coffee, you look like you could use it." "Please," Clara said, grateful for the change of subject. The sheriff led her to the kitchen, where Annie sat at a worn wooden table, carefully working on what appeared to be arithmetic problems. Her penmanship was precise, almost frantically neat, as if perfection in small things could ward off chaos in larger ones. As the sheriff busied himself with the coffee pot, Clara noticed the details that painted a picture of loss, the third chair pushed against the wall, gathering dust. The woman's apron still hanging on a hook by the door. The sampler on the wall embroidered with "Home is where love lives" in careful stitches, now fading. "Sugar?" the sheriff asked, setting a steaming mug before her. "No, thank you. Black is fine." He raised an eyebrow slightly. Apparently this was not the answer he expected from a woman in a wedding dress. "My father was a doctor," Clara explained, wrapping her hands around the mug's warmth. "He believed sugar was a luxury that weakened character. Harsh philosophy for a doctor. He was a harsh man, but not unkind. There's a difference." The sheriff studied her for a moment, then nodded as if she'd passed some sort of test. "There is indeed." They drank their coffee in silence, Annie's pencil scratching against paper the only sound. Clara found herself stealing glances at the child, noticing the way she pressed too hard with her pencil, the white-knuckled grip that suggested she was holding on to more than just the writing instrument. "Your penmanship is excellent," Clara offered. Annie looked up, startled by the direct address. "Mother taught me. Before." The single word "before" contained an entire tragedy. Clara recognized the shorthand of grief, the way it divided time into segments before and after, when things were whole and when they were broken. "She must have been a good teacher," Clara said gently. "The best," Annie whispered, then returned to her work with renewed intensity. The sheriff cleared his throat. "The boarding house might have a room after all. I can check with Mrs. Patterson. She owes me a favor." "That's kind of you, but I truly can't afford—" "You could work for your keep. She needs help with cooking and cleaning. It's honest work." Clara nodded, through the thought of being at the mercy of another stranger's charity made her stomach turn. "I appreciate your help, Sheriff Turner." "Elias," he said suddenly, then seemed surprised by his own words. "My name is Elias." "Elias?" Clara repeated, testing the name. It suited him, solid, biblical, slightly archaic. A loud knock at the door interrupted whatever might have been said next. The sheriff's expression immediately hardened back into his professional mask. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the door with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to potential danger. Clara heard voices, the sheriff's low rumble, and another man's higher, more agitated tone. Words drifted back, found blood, up at the mine. The sheriff returned, already reaching for his coat and gun belt. "I have to go. There's been an incident at the silver mine." "Of course," Clara said, standing. "I should leave anyway. I've imposed enough." "No." The word came out sharper than he seemed to intend. He paused, moderating his tone. "The storm's getting worse. You'll stay here until I return, then we'll sort out the boarding house. Annie knows where everything is if you need it." He was gone before Clara could protest, leaving her alone with the silent child and the weight of being a stranger in a strange home. Annie looked up from her arithmetic. "He won't be back until late. He never is when there's trouble at the mine." "Does trouble happen often at the mine?" "Often enough." Annie closed her book with careful precision. "Are you really going to stay at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house?" "I suppose so, if she'll have me." "She's mean," Annie said matter-of-factly. "She hits the serving girls with her wooden spoon when they spill things. Mary Crawford showed me the bruises." Clara felt her heart sink further. Well, perhaps there are other options. Not for women alone. Not respectable ones, anyway. Annie stood moving to the window to watch the snow beginning to fall in earnest. Father doesn't know about Mrs. Patterson's spoon. He doesn't notice things like that anymore. Not since Mother. "When did she—" Clara stopped herself, but Annie answered anyway. 14 months ago. Fever took her. Took my baby brother too before he was even born." She pressed her small hand against the cold window glass. "Father built that swing for them, for Mother to sit with the baby come spring. Now it just sits there collecting snow." Clara moved to stand beside the child, looking out at the swing that would never hold its intended occupants. "My mother died when I was 12. Consumption. I used to keep her teacup on my dresser unused, like maybe she'd come back for one more cup." Annie turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. "What happened to the cup?" "I brought it with me. It's in my suitcase. Still unused." Clara smiled softly. "Some things we can't let go of even when we know we should. Father won't let us change anything of Mother's. Her clothes are still in the wardrobe. Her garden gloves are still by the back door." Annie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Sometimes I forget she's gone just for a second when I wake up. Then I remember and it's like she dies all over again." Clara's heart ached for this serious child carrying such heavy grief. Without thinking, she placed a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder. The girl stiffened but didn't pull away. "Would you like to help me?" Clara asked suddenly. "I need to get out of this ridiculous dress, but I can't manage all these buttons alone. And frankly, I'd rather burn it than look at it again." Annie's eyes widened slightly. "You'd burn your wedding dress?" "Why not? It's not like I'll be needing it, besides." Clara leaned in conspiratorially. "I think it would make excellent kindling. All this silk and lace, it'll go up beautifully." A sound escaped Annie that might have been the ghost of a laugh. "Father would say that's wasteful." "Well, your father isn't here. And sometimes a little destruction can be therapeutic. Don't you think?" Annie considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. "I'll get the scissors. We can cut it up first. Fire catches better that way." As Annie ran upstairs, her footsteps showing more energy than Clara had yet seen from her, Clara realized she'd made a decision without consciously meaning to. She wouldn't go to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. She wouldn't subject herself to wooden spoons and servitude. She'd find another way, even if she had to sleep in this kitchen, and earn her keep cooking and cleaning for the taciturn sheriff and his grief-stricken daughter. Annie returned with scissors and one of her mother's old dresses, a practical brown wool that would fit Clara well enough. This was Mother's everyday dress. Father won't notice it's gone. He only guards the pretty ones. Together they worked to free Clara from the wedding dress, Annie's small fingers surprisingly deft with the tiny pearl buttons. When Clara finally stood in her chemise and corset, she grabbed the scissors herself. "Would you like the first cut?" she offered Annie. The child took the scissors reverently, then made a decisive cut right through the bodice. The sound of ripping silk filled the kitchen like a declaration of war against false promises and broken dreams. They worked together in increasingly comfortable silence, reducing the dress to ribbons and scraps. With each cut, Clara felt something lifting from her shoulders, not just the weight of the dress, but the weight of the humiliation, the abandonment, the fear. "It's rather satisfying, isn't it?" Annie observed, holding up a particularly long strip of lace. "Incredibly so," Clara agreed, snipping through the beaded waistband she'd spent 3 weeks sewing by hand. By the time they'd finished, the kitchen table was covered in white silk carnage. Annie's cheeks had gained color, and her eyes held a spark of something that might have been joy, or at least its distant cousin. "Now for the fire," Annie asked, hopefully. "Now for the fire," Clara confirmed. They fed the pieces to the kitchen stove one by one, watching the silk curl and blacken the beads pop and melt. The lace went up in quick, bright flames that danced like celebration rather than destruction. "It's beautiful," Annie breathed, mesmerized by the flames. "The most beautiful thing that dress has ever done," Clara agreed. They were so absorbed in their pyromaniac therapy that neither heard the front door open or the heavy footsteps approaching until the sheriff's voice boomed from the doorway. "What in the hell?" He stopped short, taking in the scene Clara in his late wife's dress. Annie smiling, actually smiling, and the remains of what was clearly a wedding dress scattered across his kitchen table. "We're having a funeral," Annie announced, her chin lifting with a defiance that was pure Turner, "for Miss Clara's wedding dress. It needed to die." The sheriff's gaze moved from his daughter to Clara, who stood there in brown wool, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. Something shifted in his expression: confusion, concern, and something else Clara couldn't quite identify. "Is that so?" And he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "It was therapeutic," Annie added, clearly proud of the new word. "Miss Clara said so." "Miss Clara said that, did she?" The sheriff's eyes hadn't left Clara's face. "And is Miss Clara planning more therapeutic destruction in my kitchen?" "That depends," Clara said, finding her courage. "Do you have anything that needs burning?" For a moment the kitchen held its breath. Then, incredibly impossibly, the corner of the sheriff's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one might still be possible buried somewhere beneath the grief and duty. "The mine accident?" Clara asked, changing the subject to safer ground. "Handled. Cave-in on the lower level, but everyone got out." He moved to the stove, warming his hands. "Though I noticed you didn't go to Mrs. Patterson's as discussed." "Annie informed me about the wooden spoon policy," Clara said carefully. "I thought perhaps we could discuss alternatives." "Did she now?" He glanced at his daughter, who was trying to look innocent while feeding another piece of lace to the flames. "And what alternatives did you have in mind?" Clara took a breath, knowing she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I could work for you, keep house, cook, help with Annie's schooling, just until the weather clears and I can find proper employment. I'm excellent with numbers. I can read Latin and French, and I make the best apple pie in Philadelphia. Or I did when I had access to apples and a proper oven." "This is a proper oven," Annie protested. "Mother baked in it all the time." Another silence fell heavier this time. The sheriff looked at his daughter at the first sign of animation he'd likely seen in 14 months. Then at Clara standing in his dead wife's dress like a question mark in human form. "1 week," he said finally. "The weather should clear by then, and you can take the train back east or wherever you decide to go. You'll sleep in the spare room. It's clean but cold. You'll help with household duties and Annie's education. No charity, you work for your keep." "That's fair," Clara agreed, though she wondered if anything about this situation could be called fair. "And no more burning things in my kitchen without permission," he added, though that almost smile threatened the corner of his mouth again. "I make no promises," Clara said. "I might find other things that need therapeutic destruction." Annie actually giggled, a sound that made her father's eyes widen, as if he'd witnessed a miracle. 1 week, he repeated, but Clara heard what he didn't say 1 week to see if this strange woman who burned wedding dresses and made his daughter laugh might somehow fit into the frozen geometry of their grief. As the last of the silk turned to ash, Clara realized that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. She'd come to Frost Hollow to be Theodore Morrison's bride, a fiction written in lying letters. But perhaps she'd become something else entirely. Something real, something necessary. Something that had nothing to do with the promises of strangers and everything to do with the careful navigation of damaged hearts. Outside, the storm intensified, sealing them into the house like fate's own hand. 1 week, Clara thought. 1 week to prove she belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't the somewhere she'd expected. Annie tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Clara? Would you teach me French? Mother always said a lady should speak French." "I'd be delighted," Clara replied, catching the sheriff's eye over his daughter's head. He nodded once, a gesture that might have been approval or simply resignation. Then he turned to tend the fire, adding wood to keep the flames burning bright against the gathering dark. The storm that night would be remembered as one of the worst in Frost Hollow's history. It would trap them in that house for 3 days, during which time Clara would teach Annie French words for things that made her laugh, cook meals from whatever she could find in the pantry, and slowly, carefully begin to thaw the ice that had formed around 2 hearts that had forgotten spring was possible. But that first night, as Clara lay in the spare room's cold bed, listening to the wind howl like a living thing, she thought about the wedding dress reduced to ash in the stove below. She'd burned her past, her plans, her perfectly constructed future, and in the morning she would wake to a blank page, a fresh snowfall, and the possibility that sometimes the best stories were the ones you never meant to write. The house settled around her, creaking with the weight of snow and memory. Somewhere down the hall she heard footsteps, the sheriff checking on Annie, probably maintaining his vigilant watch against a world that had already taken too much from them. Clara pulled the quilts higher, breathing in the scent of lavender that still clung to them, the ghost of the woman who'd made this house a home. She wondered if Margaret Turner, for that had been her name according to the sampler in the kitchen, would approve of a stranger wearing her dress, teaching her daughter French, standing in her kitchen. Then Clara remembered Annie's laugh, that unexpected sound of joy, and decided that any mother would forgive much to hear her child laugh again. Tomorrow would bring questions from the town, the need to establish routines, the awkwardness of navigating someone else's grief while carrying her own humiliation. But tonight, Clara allowed herself one moment of something that felt dangerously like hope. She'd traveled across a continent to marry a fiction. Instead, she'd found something far more complex, a real family, broken and wary, but real nonetheless. Whether they would let her help piece them back together remained to be seen. 1 week. 7 days to prove that sometimes the best-laid plans were the ones that fell apart, leaving room for something unexpected to take root in the ruins. The storm raged on, but inside the Turner house, 3 souls slept more peacefully than they had in a very long time, unaware that fate had already begun weaving their stories together with threads stronger than any wedding dress could ever be. The 3rd day of the storm broke with weak sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows, and Clara woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Not just Elias and Annie, but others, their tones carrying the particular pitch of gossip barely contained. She dressed quickly in Margaret's brown wool dress, pinning her hair with practiced efficiency, and descended to find Mrs. Hawthorne and 2 other women seated in the parlor, their eyes sharp as hawks circling prey. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Hawthorne's voice dripped false sweetness. "We've come to check on your welfare given your unfortunate circumstances." Annie sat rigid on the sofa, her face returned to its mask of solemnity. Elias stood by the fireplace, his expression carved from stone. The very air in the room felt charged with unspoken accusations. "How kind of you," Clara replied, moving to stand near Annie, her hand briefly touching the child's shoulder in reassurance. "Though, as you can see, I'm quite well." "Living in the sheriff's house," one of the other women introduced as Mrs. Coleman observed with raised eyebrows. "Unchaperoned. You must understand how this appears." "I understand that Sheriff Turner showed Christian charity to a woman stranded in a blizzard," Clara responded evenly. "Unless charity has become scandalous in Frost Hollow." "Charity is one thing," Mrs. Hawthorne countered, "but propriety must be maintained. The sheriff is a widower, you're an unmarried woman, who sleeps in the spare room and works for her keep." Elias interrupted, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Miss Whitmore has been helping with Annie's education and household management during the storm. Nothing improper has occurred or will occur under my roof. Still, Mrs. Coleman persisted, people will talk. They already are. Poor Annie doesn't need to be exposed to more scandal. What scandal? Annie's voice cut through the room like a blade. Everyone turned to look at the child who so rarely spoke to strangers. Miss Clara teaches me French and helps me with arithmetic. She makes better biscuits than Mrs. Patterson's cook, and she doesn't hit anyone with spoons. The last comment made Mrs. Coleman shift uncomfortably. Apparently the wooden spoon was an open secret everyone pretended not to know. Child, Mrs. Hawthorne began, but Annie wasn't finished. Mother would want Father to have help. She wouldn't want us eating burnt eggs and cold beans forever. Annie's chin lifted, her pale eyes fierce. Miss Clara is staying. Annie, Elias said quietly, that's enough. But Clara saw something in his expression, pride in his daughter's defense, even as he tried to maintain neutrality. Perhaps, Clara said, stepping forward, you ladies would like some coffee. I've just made a fresh pot and there are apple turnovers cooling in the kitchen. The mention of fresh baking caused a visible shift in the room. Mrs. Hawthorne's nose twitched, catching the scent of cinnamon and butter wafting from the kitchen. Well, Mrs. Coleman said slowly, suppose we could stay for a moment. As Clara served coffee and turnovers, she'd found apples in the cold cellar and made do with what she could find. She watched the women's faces change from suspicion to surprise. The turnovers were perfect, flaky, and golden with just the right amount of sweetness. This is quite good, Mrs. Hawthorne admitted grudgingly. My grandmother's recipe, Clara said. She believed that good food could solve most of life's problems, or at least make them more bearable. You cook like this regularly? Mrs. Coleman asked, taking her second turnover. When I have proper ingredients, yes, though I've learned to improvise. Yesterday, I made a decent soup from dried beans, salt pork, and whatever vegetables I could find in the cellar. The women exchanged glances. Good cooking was currency in a mining town where most men lived on beans and whiskey, and decent cooks were worth their weight in silver. The Hartley family is looking for someone to help with their new baby, Mrs. Hawthorne said carefully. Mrs. Hartley is overwhelmed with the twins and the newborn. They pay well. I'll consider it, Clara said diplomatically, though she had no intention of leaving the Turner house just yet. Once the road's clear. After the women left trailing crumbs and slightly mollified expressions, Elias turned to Clara. Apple turnovers as weapons of war. Sometimes the best defense is a good pastry, Clara replied, beginning to clear the dishes. They'll still gossip, but at least now they'll mention the turnovers too. Miss Clara, Annie said suddenly, will you really leave when the week is over? Clara paused, meeting Elias's eyes over his daughter's head. That depends on many things, Annie. On what? The child pressed. On whether I'm needed, Clara said simply, and wanted. Elias cleared his throat, moving toward the door. I need to check on the town, see how the roads are faring. Annie, practice your French with Miss Whitmore. After he left, Annie moved closer to Clara. Father needs you, she whispered. He just doesn't know how to say it. He doesn't know how to say anything anymore. Clara smoothed the girl's hair gently. Sometimes people need time to remember how to speak their hearts. Mother used to say that Father felt everything too deeply. That's why he seemed so cold, like he had to freeze his feelings or they'd overwhelm him. Annie picked at a loose thread on her dress. After she died, he froze completely. But you haven't, Clara observed. You're thawing bit by bit. I can see it. You make it easier, Annie admitted. You don't look at me like I'm broken. That's because you're not broken, dear one. You're grieving. There's a profound difference. They spent the afternoon conjugating French verbs and baking bread, the kitchen warm with steam and accomplishment. Annie laughed when Clara taught her French insults disguised as compliments, phrases she could use on the gossiping women without their knowledge. Votre chapeau est aussi charmant qu'un corbeau mort, Annie repeated carefully. Your hat is as charming as a dead crow. Perfect, sir, Clara praised. Though perhaps save that one for special occasions. As evening approached, Elias returned with news that the roads were beginning to clear. The train would likely run again within 2 days. Clara felt Annie's hand slip into hers, squeezing tightly. 2 days, Annie whispered. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, each of them aware of time's passage. Clara had made pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. Elias ate with focused attention as if memorizing the flavors. "This is excellent," he said finally. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Necessity," Clara replied. "After Mother died, Father was useless in the kitchen. It was learn to cook or survive on his attempts at soup, which generally resembled dishwater with ambitions." "You've never mentioned your father beyond his profession," Elias observed. "He died 2 years ago. Heart failure. He was treating patients until the day he collapsed." Clara paused, remembering. "He always said he'd die working, and he was right. Is that why you answered the advertisement, 'No family left'?" Clara nodded. "No family, no prospects, and Philadelphia society has little use for educated women without connections or fortune. When Theodore's or whoever he really was, when his letters came, they seemed like Providence." "Providence has a cruel sense of humor," Elias said darkly. "Or perhaps a complex one," Clara suggested. "After all, if I hadn't been deceived, I wouldn't be here teaching Annie French insults and making pot roast." "Madame Hawthorne est une vieille chèvre," Annie interjected proudly. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Do I want to know what that means?" "Probably not," Claire and Annie said in unison, then looked at each other and giggled. Something shifted in Elias's expression, a crack in the ice. "Margaret would have liked you," he said quietly the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his wife. "She appreciated women with spine and humor." "Tell me about her," Clara said gently. Elias was quiet for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, like water through a broken dam, words began to flow. "She was nothing like what I expected when we married. I thought I was getting a proper Eastern lady, all manners and decoration. Instead, I got Margaret. She could shoot better than most men, cursed in 3 languages, and once punched Big Tom in the face when he suggested women shouldn't vote." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She was magnificent." "She sounds it," Clara agreed. "She made this house alive." He continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Every room had flowers in summer, even if they were just wildflowers from the meadow. She'd sing while she cooked terribly off-key, but with such joy you didn't care. And she loved Annie with a fierceness that could move mountains." "She still does," Annie said quietly. "I feel her sometimes, especially in the garden, like she's waiting for spring to come back." Elias reached across the table, taking his daughter's small hand in his large one. "Spring always comes back, little one, even after the longest winter." That night Clara couldn't sleep. She stood by her window watching moonlight turn the snow-covered world into something from a fairy tale. Tomorrow would bring decision, stay or go fight for a place here or retreat to safer ground. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Annie stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her nightgown. "Can't sleep either?" Clara asked. Annie shook her head, padding across the cold floor to join Clara at the window. "I heard Father walking around. He does that when he's thinking too hard." "What do you think he's thinking about?" "You," Annie said simply. "Whether to ask you to stay or let you go because it's the proper thing to do." "And what do you think he should do?" "I think he should stop being noble and start being happy," Annie said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "Mother wouldn't want us to stay frozen forever." They stood together watching the moon traverse the sky, 2 souls caught between winter and the promise of spring. Finally, Annie yawned, and Clara walked her back to her room, tucking her in with practiced care. "Miss Clara Schwalm," Annie whispered as Clara turned to go. "If you leave, will you write to me?" "Every week," Clara promised. "In French and English both." "That's not the same as having you here." "No," Clara agreed softly. "It's not." The next morning brought unexpected visitors, the Hartley family Mrs. Hawthorne had mentioned. Mrs. Hartley looked exhausted, a baby on her hip, and twin boys of about 5 racing around her skirts. Mr. Hartley, a successful mine owner, had the harried look of a man outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Hartley began without preamble, "I need help, desperately. The twins are wild, the baby never sleeps, and my husband thinks throwing money at the problem will solve it. I need someone with sense and backbone." "Mrs. Hawthorne mentioned you might need assistance," Clara said carefully. Assistance? Mrs. Hartley laughed, a sound bordering on hysteria. I need a miracle, but I'll settle for someone who can cook, manage children, and won't run screaming after a week. I'll pay $30 a month plus room and board. It was a generous offer, more than fair. Clara glanced at Elias, who stood silent by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. That's very kind, Clara began. 40 son, Mr. Hartley interrupted. 40 a month if you can start immediately. James? Mrs. Hartley protested. You can't just... I can and I will, he said firmly. Do you have any idea what I had for dinner last night? Burnt beans and raw biscuits. The twins put a frog in my boots, and the baby hasn't stopped crying in 3 days. Actually, one of the twins piped up. It was a toad, not a frog. Not helping Thomas, Mr. Hartley said wearily. Clara felt the weight of decision pressing on her shoulders. This was safety, respectability, a clear path forward. She looked at Annie, whose face had gone pale, then at Elias, who continued to stare at the fire as if it held answers. I need time to consider, Clara said finally. May I give you an answer tomorrow? Of course, Mrs. Hartley said, though her desperation was evident. But please don't take too long. The twins have discovered matches and I'm running out of furniture. After the Hartleys left trailing chaos like a comet's tail, the Turner house felt impossibly quiet. Annie fled to her room and Elias disappeared into his study, leaving Clara alone with her turmoil. She was polishing silver, Margaret's wedding silver, she realized with a pang when Elias found her an hour later. It's a good offer, he said without preamble. The Hartleys are decent people, wealthy enough to treat you well. You'd be safe there. Safe, Claire repeated, polishing a spoon with unnecessary vigor. Yes, I suppose I would be. Annie would understand. Children adapt. Do they? Clara set down the spoon with more force than intended. Because from where I stand, Annie has been adapting for 14 months, and it's killing her slowly. That's not... Elias stopped, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about Annie. Isn't it? Clara turned to face him fully. Then what is it about Elias? Tell me plainly. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and Clara saw the battle raging behind those winter sky eyes. You've been here 5 days. 5 days and already Annie laughs again. She speaks without prompting. She's eating properly for the first time in months. And you, Clara asked softly, what have these 5 days meant to you? He stopped, his jaw working as if words were physical things that hurt to produce. I don't have the right to ask you to stay. You're young, educated, you deserve better than a widowed sheriff with a damaged daughter and a house full of ghosts. What if I don't want better? Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the lines grief had carved around his eyes. What if I want real? You don't know what you're saying. The town will gossip viciously. They'll call you a gold digger, an opportunist who took advantage of a grieving family. Let them, Clara said fiercely. I've already been called a fool for believing in love letters from a phantom. What's one more judgment from people who don't matter? Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Ask me to stay, she whispered. Not for Annie, not for propriety, not for any reason, except that you want me here. Ask me Elias. He was silent for so long Clara thought she'd lost that pride, and propriety would win as they so often did. Then he reached out his calloused hand, cupping her cheek with surprising gentleness. Stay, he said roughly. God help me, Clara, stay. I don't know what I'm offering you. I'm half frozen inside, more ghost than man most days. But Annie needs you and I... He stopped, swallowing hard. I need you too. I didn't expect to, didn't want to, but watching you with her, seeing this house come alive again. Stay. Clara covered his hand with her own, feeling the tremor in his fingers. On one condition. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of his dry humor surfacing. Already negotiating. No more sleeping in the spare room, she said, then blushed furiously as his eyes widened. I mean, Annie's room has that trundle bed. I could stay there, be more help with her nightmares. It would be more proper, actually, than being down the hall. Annie has nightmares. Almost every night, She comes to my door but doesn't knock, just stands there. I've been pretending to wake up naturally and inviting her in." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't know. She used to go to Margaret, but since then, I thought they'd stopped." "Children are experts at hiding pain when they think it will burden others," Clara said gently. "As are adults, I've noticed. You'll stay then, truly, for as long as you'll have me." He pulled her closer, and for a moment Clara thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like a man who'd forgotten what air tasted like. "Margaret would approve," he whispered. "She always said I thought too much, felt too deeply, moved too slowly. She'd like that you don't let me retreat into stone." Before Clara could respond, a crash came from upstairs, followed by Annie's voice calling out in distress. They broke apart, rushing toward the sound, and found Annie standing in her mother's room, a place Clara had never seen open before, surrounded by fallen boxes from the closet. "I'm sorry," Annie gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to smell her perfume to remember, but I knocked over the boxes and shh, little one." Elias scooped his daughter into his arms, something he hadn't done in Clara's presence before. "It's all right." Clara surveyed the scattered contents, photographs, letters, clothes, that still held the shape of the woman who'd worn them. Her eye caught on something gleaming in the corner, and she picked it up carefully. A locket, gold and delicate, with an inscription too worn to read. "That was Mother's," Annie said, hiccuping through her tears. "She wore it every day. Father gave it to her when they married." Elias set Annie down gently and took the locket from Clara, his fingers tracing the worn surface. Then, surprising them all, he reached out and fastened it around Annie's neck. "She'd want you to have it," he said quietly, "to remember that love doesn't end just because someone leaves. It just changes shape." Annie fingered the locket wonderingly, then threw her arms around her father's neck. Over his daughter's head, Elias's eyes met Clara's, and she saw the moment he truly decided to let her in, not just into his house, but into the careful reconstruction of their family. "Miss Clara's staying," he told Annie, who pulled back to look at him with wonder. "If that's acceptable to you, of course." "Really?" Annie turned to Clara. "Really, truly?" "Really, truly," Clara confirmed. Annie launched herself at Clara, nearly knocking her over with the force of her embrace. "We can learn more French and bake every day, and you'll help me with arithmetic, even though it's awful." All of that and more. Clara promised, holding the child tight. That evening, they moved Clara's few belongings into Annie's room, setting up the trundle bed with fresh linens that smelled of lavender. Margaret's lavender carefully preserved in the linen closet, like a memory made tangible. Annie chattered excitedly about all the things they would do together, while Elias carried Clara's suitcase with careful deliberation, as if moving her belongings was a sacred trust. "The town will talk," he warned again as they stood in the hallway after Annie had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep. "They're already talking," Clara pointed out. "At least now we're giving them something interesting to discuss." "I should court you properly," he said, looking uncomfortable with the admission. "Take you on walks, bring you flowers, all the things a decent man does." "Elias," Clara said gently, "I came here to marry a man who didn't exist. I think we can dispense with conventional courtship, don't you? Still, you deserve—" She stopped him with a finger to his lips. "I deserve honesty, kindness, and a chance at happiness. You've offered all three. The rest is just decoration." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers down her spine. "You're dangerous, Clara Whitmore. You make me believe spring might actually come again." "It will," she promised, "but first we have to survive the rest of winter." The next morning brought chaos in the form of the Hartley twins, who had apparently escaped their house and were building what appeared to be a snow fortress in the Turners' front yard. Mrs. Hartley arrived minutes later, the baby wailing in her arms, her hair resembling a bird's nest after a storm. "Please," she said to Clara without preamble, "I'll give you $50 a month. 60. Name your price." "I'm afraid I must decline," Clara said gently. "I've accepted a position here." Mrs. Hartley looked between Clara and Elias, understanding dawning on her exhausted features. Oh, I see. Well, that's unexpected." "Thoroughly," Elias agreed dryly. "But if you need temporary help," Clara offered, I could perhaps spare a few hours a week to teach you some management techniques for the twins, and recipes that they might actually eat without revolution. Mrs. Hartley's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Would you really? Of course, we women must support each other, mustn't we? As Mrs. Hartley wrangled her twins, who had somehow managed to put snow down each other's shirts, while the adults were talking, she turned back with a wry smile. You know, Miss Whitmore, when you arrived in that wedding dress, I thought you were just another Eastern fool chasing Western dreams. But you might just be the smartest woman in Frost Hollow. Why do you say that? Because you've done what half the widows and spinsters in town have been trying to do for 14 months. You've thawed Elias Turner. She glanced at the sheriff, who was helping untangle the fighting twins with surprising patience. And that, my dear, is no small feat. Word spread through Frost Hollow like wildfire in August. By noon, Clara had received visits from 6 different women, all with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment in their eyes. She served them coffee and whatever baked goods she could manage, answered their questions with polite deflection, and watched Annie practice her French insults under her breath. Cette femme ressemble à un chou bouilli, Annie muttered as Mrs. Coleman left, having spent 30 minutes explaining why Clara's situation was highly irregular. What does that mean? Elias asked, having caught the tone, if not the words. That woman looks like boiled cabbage, Clara translated, trying not to laugh. Accurate, Elias observed, his lips twitching. Though perhaps we should limit the French insults to private moments. Where's the fun in that? Annie protested. That afternoon, while Annie napped and the house was quiet, Clara found Elias in his study, surrounded by ledgers and looking thoroughly miserable. The mine's books, she guessed. Town finances. The mayor decided that since I have so much free time, I should audit the accounts. He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Numbers aren't my strong suit. May I? Clara gestured to the ledgers. You understand accounting. My father taught me. He said women should understand money since men so rarely did it properly. She pulled a chair beside his, trying not to notice how his nearness affected her pulse. Let's see what we have here. For the next hour they worked side by side, Clara's quick mind untangling the messy columns, while Elias provided context for the various expenses. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same paper, and neither pulled away. There, Clara said finally, showing him the corrected calculations. You were being overcharged for supplies by nearly 15%. How did I miss that? Because you're an honest man who assumes others are too, Clara said simply. It's not a fault, just a vulnerability. He studied her face, his expression intense. You're quite remarkable, you know that. I'm practical, she corrected. There's a difference. No, he said softly. You're remarkable. The way you've handled everything, the humiliation of your arrival, Annie's needs, the town's gossip with such grace and humor. Margaret would have adored you. You speak of her more easily now, Clara observed. You make it easier. You don't flinch when I mention her, don't act like she's a forbidden topic. It's freeing. She was part of making you who you are, Clara said. Why would I want to erase that? He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think about him? The man who deceived you, Clara considered. Sometimes, not with longing, but with curiosity. What kind of person creates such an elaborate fiction? Was it always meant to be cruel, or did he convince himself it was real too? Does it matter? Not anymore, Clara admitted. His deception brought me here. In the strangest way, I owe him a debt. That's a generous view of betrayal. Or a practical one. Bitterness is exhausting, and I have too much to do to waste energy on it. Elias reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. What did I do to deserve you walking into my life? You opened your door during a blizzard, Clara said simply. Sometimes that's all fate needs, one open door. That evening, as Clara helped Annie with her bath, the child asked, Will you marry father? Clara nearly dropped the soap. That's a big question, little one, but a logical one. You're living here, you take care of us, you make father smile. In books, that always leads to marriage. Life isn't exactly like books, Annie. It could be, Annie said stubbornly, if people would just cooperate. Clara laughed, rinsing soap from Annie's hair. And what would you think about that? If your father and I... If things progressed in that direction? Annie was quiet for a moment, then said, Mother told me once that hearts are like houses. They can hold more than one family if you build them right. She said it when Mrs. Miller died and Mr. Miller remarried. Everyone said it was too soon, but Mother said love doesn't follow schedules. Your mother sounds like she was very wise. She was, and I think she'd like you. You both see the world as it could be, not just as it is. Later, after Annie was asleep, Clara stood on the porch watching stars appear in the clear winter sky. Elias joined her, bringing a shawl for her shoulders. The train's running again, he said quietly. Came through this afternoon. I know. You could still leave. Find a place without complications, without gossip, without you. Clara interrupted. Without Annie. Without this house that's starting to feel like home. No, thank you. Clara, I need to be clear about something. He turned her to face him, his hands warm on her shoulders. I'm not whole. I may never be whole again. Part of me died with Margaret, and that part isn't coming back. I'm not asking for whole, Clara said. I'm asking for real, for honest, for whatever you can give while you heal. And if I never fully heal, then we'll be partially broken together. That sounds better than being perfectly intact alone. He kissed her then, sudden and fierce, like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to want things. Clara melted into him, her hands fisting in his coat, feeling the ice around his heart crack and shift. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. The proper thing would be to wait, to let morning pass to court you appropriately. When have we done anything properly? Clara asked. I arrived in a wedding dress to marry a phantom. You took in a stranger during a blizzard. Annie speaks French insults to gossips. We're not a proper family, Elias. We're a real one. The town will talk regardless. Let them. We'll be too busy living to notice. He kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise rather than a plea. Margaret told me once that I'd know when it was time to live again, that something would wake me up. I thought she was wrong that I'd stay frozen forever. And now I think she might have been right about everything. She usually was. They stood together watching the stars wheel overhead, two damaged souls finding warmth in each other's presence. Inside, Annie slept peacefully for the first time in months, the locket around her neck catching moonlight like a blessing. The next morning brought unexpected sunshine and a telegram that would change everything. Elias read it twice, his face paling before handing it to Clara. It's from a lawyer in Denver, he said. Theodore Morrison, his real name was James Fletcher, was arrested trying the same scheme there. They found evidence of 12 women he'd deceived over the past 2 years. They want you to testify. Clara stared at the telegram, feeling a strange mix of vindication and pity. 12 women, 12 broken hearts, and empty pockets. You don't have to go. They have enough evidence without you. But I should, Clara said slowly. For closure, if nothing else. To look him in the eye and show him he didn't destroy me. We'll go together, Elias said firmly. All three of us. Annie could use a trip and I have business in Denver anyway. You don't have business in Denver. I do now. His jaw set stubbornly. You're not facing him alone. Annie, who had been listening from the doorway, ran to Clara and wrapped her arms around her waist. We're a family now. Families face things together. Clara looked at these two people who had become her world in just a week's time and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new truth. She'd come to Frost Hollow to marry a lie, but she'd found something infinitely more precious, a love built on truth, on shared grief and tentative joy, on French insults and burned wedding dresses and apple turnovers served to gossiping neighbors. Yes, she said, holding Annie close while meeting Elias's eyes. We're a family, and families face things together. The train to Denver carried them through mountain passes still heavy with snow, and Clara watched Annie press her nose against the window, marveling at views she'd never seen before. Elias sat across from them in their private compartment. He'd insisted on the expense. Despite Clara's protests, his presence both protective and slightly uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure how to navigate this new configuration of their lives. Look, Miss Clara, Annie exclaimed, pointing at a frozen waterfall cascading down a cliff face. It's like God made ice sculptures just for us. Beautiful things often come from frozen moments, Clara replied, catching Elias's eye. He shifted in his seat, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, his version of a smile that was becoming more frequent, like spring flowers pushing through snow. They'd been traveling for 6 hours when Annie finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken since they'd boarded. What if he says terrible things about you in the courtroom? Clara set down the book she'd been pretending to read. Then I'll know they're the words of a desperate man who's been caught. His opinion of me stopped mattering the moment I realized he never existed. But won't it hurt? Annie persisted with the directness of a child who'd learned that pain was part of life's curriculum. Perhaps, Clara admitted, but I've been hurt before and survived. The trick is not letting hurt turn into hardness. She glanced at Elias, who was studying his hands as if they held answers. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay soft despite the sharp edges of the world. Elias looked up, then something raw and grateful in his expression. Margaret used to say something similar, that courage wasn't about not feeling pain, it was about feeling it and choosing love anyway. Your wife was a philosopher, Clara said gently. She was everything. Elias replied, then paused, reconsidering. She was everything then. Now there's room for more without diminishing what was. The words hung in the compartment like a confession, and Annie reached over to take her father's hand. Mother would like that you're not frozen anymore, she said simply. She hated when you got too serious. Remember when she put soap in your coffee because you hadn't smiled in 3 days? That was salt, Elias corrected, his eyes warming with memory, and it was because I'd been working a murder case that had gone cold. She said if I was going to be sour, I might as well taste it too. Clara laughed, imagining the scene. Did it work? After I stopped choking, yes. She could always shock me out of my moods. He paused, then added quietly, You have a similar talent. Before Clara could respond, the train lurched to a sudden stop, sending books sliding off the small table. Shouts erupted from the front of the train, and Elias was on his feet immediately, his hand moving instinctively to where his gun would normally rest. Stay here, he ordered, but Clara was already standing. We stay together, she said firmly. Remember family. He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Fine, but Annie stays between us. They made their way through the train cars, other passengers pressed against windows, trying to see what had caused the stop. At the front they found the conductor arguing with 3 men on horseback who'd blocked the tracks with a fallen tree. Not a robbery, the conductor was saying. This is a legitimate railway, and we have a sheriff aboard. Sheriff Turner, one of the men interrupted, touching his hat mockingly as Elias approached. Heard you were traveling with your new woman, the one who came to marry that confidence man. Clara recognized him then, Jack Morrison from Frost Hollow, though no relation to her fictional fiancé. He'd been one of the loudest voices gossiping about her situation at the general store. Is there a problem here, Morrison? Elias's voice carried the kind of authority that made smart men reconsider their choices. No problem, Sheriff. Just wanted to make sure Miss Whitmore knows her stories made it all the way to Denver. Folks are real interested in the woman who moved into your house before your wife's barely cold in the ground. The words hit like a slap, but before Elias could respond, Clara stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, how thoughtful of you to ride all this way just to deliver gossip. Though I'm curious, did your wife know you were taking this little trip, or does she still think you're at the mining camp where you told her you'd be? Morrison's face reddened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Clara's voice was pleasant, conversational even. Annie, darling, what was that French phrase we learned about men who speak too loudly about others' business? Les hommes qui parlent le plus fort ont souvent les plus grands secrets, Annie recited perfectly. Her chin lifted in a gesture pure Elias. What did she say? Morrison demanded. She said you have lovely horses, Clara lied smoothly. Though I might add that men who have time to block trains and spread gossip might want to ensure their own houses are in order. I believe your wife has been quite lonely these past evenings. Perhaps Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house could tell you more about who's been keeping her company. The color drained from Morrison's face. It was a guess on Clara's part based on whispers she'd heard at the general store, but his reaction confirmed it. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Clara smiled sweetly. "I suppose you could risk it. Or you could move that tree and go home to your wife, grateful that not everyone spreads every bit of gossip they hear." The three men exchanged glances, then Morrison nodded sharply. "Move the tree," he told his companions. As they worked, he looked back at Clara with something between respect and wariness. "You're not what I expected, Miss Whitmore." "People rarely are, Mr. Morrison. That's why gossip is so often wrong." As the train resumed its journey, Elias pulled Clara aside in the corridor. "How did you know about Morrison and the boarding house?" "I didn't, not for certain, but guilty men always assume others know their secrets. It's remarkable how often a confident guess becomes truth in the right circumstances." "You're terrifying," he said, but there was admiration in his voice. "Remind me never to cross you." "Oh, Elias," Clara said, reaching up to straighten his collar, "you'd never give me reason to." Annie, who'd been watching with bright eyes, tugged on Clara's sleeve. "Could you teach me to do that? To make grown men afraid with just words?" "When you're older," Clara promised. "Though something tells me you've inherited enough of your father's intimidating presence and your mother's wit to manage just fine on your own." They reached Denver as evening painted the sky purple and gold. The city sprawled before them, larger and louder than anything Annie had ever seen. She clung to Clara's hand as they navigated the crowded platform, her eyes wide with wonder and worry. The hotel Elias had booked was respectable but not ostentatious. He'd learned quickly that Clara preferred comfort to showiness. They had adjoining rooms maintaining propriety while allowing them to feel like the unit they were becoming. That night, as Clara helped Annie prepare for bed in the unfamiliar room, the child asked, "What if tomorrow goes badly? What if they say you were foolish to believe him?" "Then they'd be right," Clara said, brushing Annie's hair with long, soothing strokes. "I was foolish, but foolishness isn't always wrong, Annie. Sometimes we have to risk foolishness to find wisdom." "I don't understand." "If I hadn't been foolish enough to believe those letters, I never would have come to Frost Hollow, never would have met you and your father. Sometimes our mistakes lead us exactly where we need to be." Annie turned to face, her eyes serious. "Do you love him, Father? I mean—" Clara considered lying, providing some comfortable deflection. But this child had seen too much truth to be fed pretty falsehoods. "I'm learning to. Love isn't always instant, Annie. Sometimes it grows slowly like plants under snow, invisible until spring reveals what's been developing all along. Mother said she knew she loved Father the moment he arrested her for disturbing the peace." Clara laughed. "Why was she disturbing the peace?" "She was protesting outside the town hall because they wouldn't let women attend the meetings. Father had to arrest her because the mayor insisted, but he told her she was right while he was putting on the handcuffs. She said any man who could admit a woman was right while doing his duty was worth keeping." "Your mother sounds like she was a force of nature." "She was," Annie agreed. "But you're different. You're like a river, quiet but strong, wearing down rocks not by force but by persistence." "That's quite poetic for a girl who claims to hate writing assignments." Annie grinned. "Don't tell Father. He thinks I'm terrible at composition." A knock at the connecting door interrupted them. Elias stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable in his formal suit. He'd dressed for tomorrow's court appearance, trying it on to ensure it still fit after years of disuse. "I look ridiculous," he said, tugging at the collar. "You look distinguished," Clara corrected, standing to adjust his tie. "Like a man of consequence." "I'm a small-town sheriff who hasn't worn anything but work clothes in 2 years." "You're a man defending his family," Clara said firmly. "That's all that matters." His hands came up to cover hers where they rested on his chest. "When did you become my family's defender?" "The moment Annie taught me my first French curse word," Clara replied lightly, but her eyes were serious. "Or maybe when you gave me coffee instead of judgment. Or possibly when we burned that wedding dress and made something beautiful from destruction." "Clara," he started, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Tomorrow will be difficult," she said. "James Fletcher or Theodore Morrison or whoever he really is will try to paint me as a desperate spinster who got what she deserved. The prosecutor will want me to cry and play the victim. The crowd will want drama and scandal, but what they'll get is truth, simple, unadorned truth. And then we'll come back here, have a nice dinner, and take Annie to see something wonderful in this big city before we go home. Home? Elias repeated the word, carrying weight. You really think of Frost Hollow as home now? Home isn't a place, Elias. It's people. And my people are here wearing an uncomfortable suit, and they're pretending to be asleep while eavesdropping. I'm not eavesdropping, Annie protested from her bed. I'm listening with intent. Go to sleep, little spy, Elias said, but his voice was warm with affection. Tomorrow's a big day. After Annie had truly settled, Elias and Clara sat in the sitting area of her room, going over the prosecutor's questions one more time. But eventually the preparation gave way to simple conversation, the kind that happened naturally now between them. I never expected this, Elias said quietly, staring at the gaslight flickering on the wall. When Margaret died, I thought that was the end of feeling anything but duty and grief. I was prepared to raise Annie alone to be half a man doing a whole man's job. And now I find myself thinking about spring, about teaching you to shoot properly, not the Eastern way, about Annie having someone to braid her hair who doesn't create crooked disasters, about having coffee with someone who makes me want to be more than just functional. Clara reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. I never expected this either. I came west to marry a fiction and instead found something real, something complicated and difficult and absolutely worth fighting for. Even with the gossip, the judgment, Morrison today was just the beginning. Let them gossip, Clara said fiercely. They don't know what we're building. They see a scandal. I see a family being reborn. They see impropriety. I see healing. They see me as a fortune hunter. I see myself as a woman who found treasure in the most unexpected place. Elias pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the uncomfortable suit. After tomorrow, after the trial, I want to do this properly, he said. Court you, I mean, or at least some version of it that makes sense for us. Elias Turner, are you suggesting we have a conventional relationship after all this? God, no, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. But I am suggesting we have our own version of it. Annie as our chaperone target practice is romantic outings discussing crime reports over dinner, our kind of proper. That sounds perfect, Clara said. Perfectly us. The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. Clara dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep blue wool that Elias had bought her in Frost Hollow, insisting she needed something warmer than Margaret's clothes. Annie wore her Sunday dress looking older than her 8 years, with her serious expression and her mother's locket gleaming at her throat. The courthouse was an imposing building of red stone and ambition, filled with people who'd come to witness the spectacle. Clara recognized reporters from various papers, their pencils ready to capture every dramatic moment. And then she saw him, James Fletcher. She refused to think of him as Theodore Morrison anymore, sat at the defendant's table looking smaller than his letters had suggested. He was handsome in a weak sort of way, with the kind of face that could be anyone or no one, depending on the need. When their eyes met, he had the audacity to smile sadly, as if they shared some tragic romance rather than his calculated deception. That's him, Annie whispered. He doesn't look like a villain. The worst ones never do, Elias replied grimly. Clara was called to testify within the first hour. As she walked to the witness stand, she felt the weight of every eye in the room, heard the whispers following her path. But then she looked at Elias and Annie sitting in the front row like sentinels and found her courage. The prosecutor, a thin man named Harrison, began with gentle questions about her correspondence with Fletcher. Clara answered simply without embellishment, describing the letters that had promised love security and a new life in Colorado. And you believed these promises? Harrison asked. I believed in the possibility of them, Clara corrected. I was a woman alone in a city that had no use for me. The letters offered hope. Even false hope can feel real when you're desperate enough. Tell us about your arrival in Frost Hollow. Clara described the scene at the train station, the wedding dress she'd worn, the crushing realization that she'd been deceived. She kept her voice steady, refusing to give the crowd the tears they craved. That must have been humiliating, Harrison prompted. It was educational, Clara replied. I learned that morning that dignity isn't about never falling, it's about how you choose to get back up. Fletcher's attorney, a pompous man named Whitman, took over for cross-examination. His strategy was clear from his first question. Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you're now living with Sheriff Turner? I'm employed as his housekeeper and his daughter's tutor, yes. Living in his house, unmarried. Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? You arrive seeking one man's protection and immediately transfer to another's when the first proves fictional. Clara felt Elias tense from across the room, but she remained calm. Mr. Whitman, I find it fascinating that you're more concerned with my current employment than with your client's fraud. But to answer your implication, yes, Sheriff Turner offered me shelter during a blizzard and employment when I had none. If you find Christian charity convenient, then I suppose it was. Christian charity, Whitman repeated mockingly. Is that what you call it? Moving into a widower's home within days of arrival. I call it survival, Clara said sharply. Your client took my savings, my dignity, and my trust. Sheriff Turner gave me work purpose and respect. If you can't see the difference, perhaps you need spectacles. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Whitman's face reddened. You seem quite composed for a woman who was allegedly traumatized by deception. Would you prefer I faint, cry, tear my clothes in grief? Clara asked. I'm sorry to disappoint your need for theatrics, Mr. Whitman, but I've found that surviving betrayal requires less drama and more determination. So you admit you weren't truly hurt by my client's actions. I admit that I chose not to let his cruelty define my future. There's a difference between being wounded and being destroyed. Your client wounded me. What happened afterward, that was my choice, not his. Whitman tried several more angles of attack, but Clara deflected each one with calm precision. Finally, in frustration, he asked, Do you have feelings for Sheriff Turner? The courtroom went silent. Clara could feel Elias's gaze boring into her, could sense Annie holding her breath. I have profound respect for Sheriff Turner, Clara said carefully. He's shown me that not all men are fiction writers masquerading as suitors. He's been honest, kind, and protective without asking for anything in return. If that's what you mean by feelings, then yes, I have them. So you admit you've simply replaced one man with another. Clara stood slightly straighter. Mr. Whitman, your client created an elaborate fiction to steal from desperate women. Sheriff Turner offered legitimate employment to a stranded stranger. Your client wrote pretty lies. Sheriff Turner speaks difficult truths. Your client promised everything and delivered nothing. Sheriff Turner promised nothing and delivered safety, dignity, and hope. If you see those as equivalent, then you understand neither love nor fraud. I object to the witness making speeches, Whitman protested. Sustained, the judge said, but he was hiding a smile. Though the witness makes her point clearly. Do you have any other questions, counselor? Whitman, recognizing defeat, dismissed Clara. As she walked back to her seat, Fletcher suddenly stood. Clara, he called out, his voice carrying the same false warmth as his letters. I did care for you. The feelings were real, even if the circumstances... No, Clara said, stopping, but not turning to face him. Nothing about you was real. You were a story I told myself when I was lonely. Now I have better stories. True ones. She took her seat between Elias and Annie, feeling their presence like armor. Annie slipped her small hand into Clara's while Elias's hand found her other one, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in silent support. The trial continued for 3 more hours with testimony from other women Fletcher had deceived. Each story was a variation on the same theme: loneliness, exploited hope, weaponized trust, betrayed. By the end, Fletcher looked less like a romantic figure and more like what he was, a common criminal who used hearts instead of guns to rob his victims. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. Fletcher would serve 5 years in prison, and the judge ordered him to make restitution to his victims, though everyone knew he'd likely spent all the money already. As they left the courthouse, reporters surrounded them shouting questions, but Elias carved a path through them like Moses through the Red Sea, his presence clearing the way. One particularly persistent reporter grabbed Clara's arm. Miss Whitmore, how does it feel to see justice served? Clara looked at the young man, seeing ambition and curiosity in his eyes. It feels like closing a book I never should have opened. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to live that has nothing to do with James Fletcher. Outside Denver's afternoon sun was bright and clean. Annie danced between them, energized by the drama and its resolution. You were magnificent, she told Clara, like a warrior queen with words instead of swords. Your vocabulary is improving, Clara observed. Magnificent is a good word. Father taught it to me. He said it's what you are. Clara looked at Elias, who was suddenly fascinated by the architecture of nearby buildings. Did he now? Among other things, Annie continued cheerfully, he also said you're formidable, brilliant, and surprisingly terrifying when provoked. Annie, Elias warned, what you did say those things last night when you thought I was asleep. Clara laughed, the sound bright in the Denver afternoon. Well, Sheriff Turner, I'm flattered by your assessment. It's accurate, he said gruffly. Watching you handle that attorney was like watching a cat play with a mouse. Poor bastard never stood a chance. They spent the afternoon showing Annie the city, the grand shops with their window displays, the park with its carefully manicured gardens, the ice cream parlor where Annie tried chocolate ice cream for the first time and declared it proof that God loved children. That evening in the hotel's dining room, Elias raised his glass of wine, a rare indulgence. To Clara Whitmore, he said, who came to Colorado to marry a lie, and instead taught a frozen sheriff and his daughter how to live again. To us, Clara corrected. To unconventional families and unexpected gifts. To being foolish enough to believe in love letters and wise enough to recognize real love when it stands in front of you in a sheriff's star and a child's smile. To Mother, Annie added quietly, lifting her glass of milk. Who would have loved this whole adventure? They drank, and Clara felt something settle in her chest, a rightness, a recognition that sometimes the worst detours led to the best destinations. Later, after Annie was asleep, Clara and Elias stood on the hotel's small balcony, looking out at Denver's lights spreading like fallen stars. Thank you, Elias said suddenly, for being strong today, for not letting them make you a victim. I'm not a victim, Clara said simply. I'm a woman who took a chance that didn't work out the way I expected, but I'd do it again knowing what I know now. Even the humiliation, the deception, especially that, because it led me to you and Annie, to a real home instead of a pretty fiction. Elias turned her to face him, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. Clara Whitmore, you've undone me completely. I was prepared to stay frozen forever, and you've gone and thawed everything with your apple turnovers and French lessons and fierce loyalty to a child who isn't even yours. She's mine in every way that matters, Clara said firmly. Blood doesn't make family, Elias. Choice does, and I choose you both every day without question or regret. He kissed her then, there on the balcony with Denver as witness, and it was nothing like the desperate kisses of new love. It was something deeper, more certain, the kiss of two people who'd seen each other's broken pieces and decided to build something new from the wreckage. When they pulled apart, Clara noticed movement in the window. Annie stood there in her nightgown, grinning broadly. It's about time, she announced. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the pantry, like Mrs. Patterson's romance novels. You've been reading Mrs. Patterson's romance novels? Elias asked, horrified. Only the educational parts, Annie said innocently. How else am I supposed to learn about adult interactions? By observing your elders and doing the opposite, Clara suggested, trying not to laugh at Elias's expression. But you two are terrible at romance, Annie protested. All you do is make meaningful looks and discuss household management. That's our version of romance, Elias said, scooping his daughter into his arms, despite her protest that she was too old for such treatment. Some people like flowers and poetry. We prefer honesty and good cooking. And French insults, Annie added. Those too, Clara agreed, joining them at the window. Especially those. They stood together looking out at the city lights, a family forged not by conventional means, but by choice, by circumstance, by the strange alchemy that turns strangers into essential parts of each other's stories. Tomorrow they would return to Frost Hollow, to the gossips and the judgment and the slow work of building a life together. There would be challenges. Elias's grief hadn't disappeared, merely shifted to make room for new love. Clara's humiliation would follow her for months, maybe years. Annie would struggle with accepting a new mother figure while honoring the memory of the one she'd lost. But tonight in a Denver hotel, with the trial behind them and the future uncertain but theirs to shape, they were simply three people who'd found each other against all odds. "Tell us a story, Miss Clara," Annie requested, yawning, "about a princess who comes to a frozen kingdom." "All right," Clara agreed, settling into a chair while Annie curled in her father's lap. "Once upon a time, there was a princess who received a letter promising her a kingdom of gold. But when she arrived, she found only a kingdom of ice with a frozen king and a lonely princess who'd forgotten how to smile." "This sounds familiar," Elias murmured. "Shh," Annie commanded. "This is the good part." Clara continued weaving a tale of thawing hearts and found families of spring coming to winter kingdoms, not through magic, but through patience and apple turnovers, and the brave decision to stay when leaving would be easier. By the time she finished, Annie was asleep in Elias's arms, and the sheriff himself looked suspiciously soft around the eyes. "That's a good story," he said quietly. "How does it end?" Clara stood kissing Annie's forehead, and then Elias's lips, gentle as a promise. "It doesn't end," she said. "It just keeps going season after season, each one better than the last, because the kingdom learned that ice can be beautiful, but warmth is essential." "That's not a proper ending," Elias protested. "No," Clara agreed, "but it's ours, and that makes it perfect." The journey back to Frost Hollow felt different than the one leaving it. Where tension had filled their compartment before now, there was a comfortable ease, as if the trial had been a test they'd passed together. Annie dozed against Clara's shoulder while Elias read through a stack of telegrams that had accumulated in his absence, occasionally sharing bits of town news that ranged from mundane to absurd. "Apparently Morrison's wife threw all his belongings into the street yesterday," he said, glancing up from one message, "right in front of the general store during peak hours." "Good for her," Clara said, stroking Annie's hair as the child shifted in sleep. "Though I imagine that's added fuel to the gossip fires about us." "Everything adds fuel to those fires. We breathe, they gossip. We don't breathe, they gossip about that too." He set aside the telegrams and studied her across the compartment. "Are you ready for it? The return will be worse than the leaving. Now they know we traveled together, shared a hotel. In separate rooms with Annie as the world's most vigilant chaperone," Clara reminded him. "Besides, I've faced worse than small-town gossip. I've faced James Fletcher's attorney." The train rounded a bend and Frost Hollow came into view, nestled in its valley like a secret the mountains kept. Smoke rose from chimneys into the late afternoon sky, and the setting sun turned the snow-covered roofs into sheets of gold. Despite everything waiting for them, there Clara felt her heart lift at the sight. "It really is beautiful," she murmured. "It's home," Elias said simply, and the word carried new meaning, now encompassing not just a place, but the people who made it worth returning to. The platform was crowded when they arrived, far more so than usual for an afternoon train. It seemed half the town had found reasons to be there, their curiosity barely disguised behind pretenses of meeting packages or waiting for relatives who didn't exist. "They're all here for the show," Annie said, fully awake now and assessing the crowd with her father's tactical eye. "Mrs. Hawthorne is pretending to read the schedule board, but it hasn't changed in 3 months. And look, there's Mr. Coleman hiding behind his newspaper. It's from last week." "Then let's give them something worth watching," Clara said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "But not what they expect." She stepped off the train first head high, wearing the same serene expression she'd perfected during the trial. Elias followed with Annie, his presence creating its usual bubble of space around them. The crowd pressed closer, waiting for drama, for tears, for something scandalous to dissect over dinner. Instead, Clara walked directly to Mrs. Hawthorne, who nearly dropped her pretense of schedule reading in surprise. "Mrs. Hawthorne, how lovely to see you," Clara said warmly. "I hope you've been well. I brought you something from Denver. They had the most wonderful tea shop near the courthouse." She pressed a small package into the woman's hands. "Lavender Earl Grey. I remembered you mentioning you missed good tea." Mrs. Hawthorne stood frozen, the package in her hands like a foreign object she didn't quite understand. You brought me tea from Denver." "Of course, one thinks of friends when traveling, doesn't one?" Smiled as if this were the most natural thing in the world. then moved through the crowd, greeting each gossip with particular kindness, asking after their health, their families, their concerns, as if she hadn't heard every cruel speculation they'd made about her. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, Elias needed to check in before heading home. The crowd had dispersed in confusion, robbed of the confrontation they'd anticipated. That was masterful, Elias said once they were alone in his office. Kill them with kindness, transform them with it, Clara corrected. Cruelty expects cruelty in return. Kindness in the face of judgment is so unexpected it forces reconsideration. Or at least confusion, Annie added, perched on her father's desk, despite repeated warnings about the practice. Did you see Mr. Coleman's face? He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Speaking of Mr. Coleman, Elias said, pulling a ledger from his drawer, I need to have a word with him about these supply costs you uncovered, but that can wait until tomorrow. They walked home through streets beginning to darken lamplight, creating pools of gold in the purple dusk. The house stood waiting for them, windows dark but somehow welcoming, as if it too had missed their presence. Annie ran ahead to unlock the door, while Clara and Elias followed more slowly, both aware they were being watched from behind curtains all along the street. They're expecting an announcement, Elias said quietly. An engagement. A scandal. Something definitive. Then they'll be disappointed. We're not a story for their entertainment, Elias. We're a life being lived. Inside, the house felt cold from 3 days empty, and they worked together to bring it back to life. Elias building up the fires while Clara started soup from ingredients that had waited patiently in the cold pantry, Annie setting the table with careful precision, using the good plates without being asked. It feels different, Annie observed as they sat down to eat. The house, I mean. Like it knows we're really a family now, not just people living in the same space. Houses absorb the emotions of those who live in them, Clara said. This one has held a lot of sadness. Maybe it's ready for something else. After dinner, as had become their custom, Annie practiced piano. She'd begun lessons with Mrs. Chen, the minister's wife, 2 weeks ago, while Clara mended clothes and Elias reviewed case files. It was domestic in a way that should have felt ordinary, but instead felt precious. This quiet evening recovered from the chaos of the trial. A knock at the door interrupted their peace. Elias answered it to find Dr. Brennan, the town physician, standing in the cold with his medical bag. Sorry to disturb, Sheriff, but there's been an accident at the mine. Cave-in on the 3rd level. They've pulled most men out, but young Timothy Watson is trapped. His legs crushed under a beam. I need to get there, but... He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. I could use assistance. Someone with steady hands and a strong stomach. I'll come, Elias said, immediately reaching for his coat. I'm coming too, Clara said, already moving toward her cloak. Clara, it's dangerous. I'm the daughter of a doctor, she interrupted. I've assisted with amputations, births, and everything in between. Dr. Brennan needs steady hands, I have them. Dr. Brennan looked between them, then nodded. I'd be grateful for the help, Miss Whitmore. Bring clean cloths if you have them. Annie, go to Mrs. Chen's house, Elias instructed. Tell her what's happened and wait there. I want to help, Annie protested. You are helping, Clara said, kneeling before the child. By being safe and letting us focus on saving Timothy. Can you do that? Annie nodded reluctantly, and they watched her run toward the minister's house before heading to the mine. The scene at the mine was chaos barely controlled. Men with lanterns clustered around the entrance, their faces grim with the knowledge that one of their own was dying slowly in the dark below. Women waited in clutches, some crying, others stone-faced, with the particular expression of mining families who'd waded through disasters before. Where is he? Dr. Brennan demanded, pushing through the crowd. 3rd level eastern shaft, Buch, the mine foreman, a grizzled man named Burke, replied. The support beam came down on his leg. We can't move it without risking the whole tunnel coming down. Then we operate where he is, Dr. Brennan said grimly. I'll need light, lots of it, and someone needs to hold him still. They descended into the mine, the walls pressing close, the air thick with dust and fear. Clara had never been underground like this, never felt the weight of mountain pressing from all sides, but she kept her breathing steady, following the doctor's sure steps. Timothy Watson was 18, barely more than a boy, his face white with pain and blood loss. His right leg disappeared under a massive beam, and even in the lantern light, Clara could see it was destroyed beyond saving. "Timothy," Dr. Brennan said gently, "I'm here to help, but I won't lie to you. The leg has to come off. It's that, or you die down here." The boy's eyes widened in terror. "No, please, I can't. My girl won't want to cripple." "Your girl will want you alive," Clara said firmly, moving to kneel by his head. "I promise you that. Living with one leg is better than dying with two." "Who are you?" Timothy asked, confused by the presence of a woman in the mine. "I'm someone who knows about losing things and surviving anyway," Clara replied. "Now I need you to look at me, only at me. Can you do that?" As doctor, Brennan prepared his instruments. Clara kept Timothy focused on her face, talking steadily about nothing and everything. The trial in Denver. Annie's French lessons, the way snow looked when the sun hit it just right. She held his hands as the doctor worked, feeling them crush hers when the pain broke through the laudanum haze. "Tell me about your girl," Clara said when Timothy's moans grew louder. "What's her name?" "Sarah," he gasped. "Sarah Mills, pretty as morning and twice as sweet. And she loves you." "Said she did. Said she'd marry me come spring." "Then she'll marry you come spring," Clara said with absolute certainty. "Love doesn't count legs, Timothy. It counts hearts, and yours is still beating." The amputation took 40 minutes that felt like hours. Elias held the lantern steady, his face carved from shadow and determination. Other miners stood ready to shore up the tunnel if it shifted. And through it all, Clara kept talking, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. When it was over, when Timothy had passed out from pain and blood loss but was still breathing, they carried him up into the night air where his family waited. His mother fell to her knees at the sight of him alive, and his father, a taciturn man who'd never shown emotion in public, wept openly. "He'll live," Dr. Brennan announced to the crowd, "thanks to quick action and," he glanced at Clara, "exceptional assistance." Sarah Mills pushed through the crowd, her face tear-streaked but determined. She looked at Timothy's unconscious form at the space where his leg should have been, and then lifted her chin with the same kind of steel Clara recognized. "When can I see him?" she asked. "He'll wake in a few hours," Dr. Brennan said. "He'll need care support." "He'll have it," Sarah said firmly. "For the rest of his life he'll have it." As the crowd dispersed, carrying Timothy to the doctor's office for proper treatment, Clara found herself standing outside the mine entrance, her dress ruined with blood and dirt, her hands still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. Elias wrapped his coat around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. "You were incredible down there," he said quietly. "The way you kept him calm kept him fighting." "I just talked," Clara said, suddenly exhausted. "It's all I could do. You did exactly what was needed. You gave him something to hold on to besides the pain." They walked home slowly, the adrenaline fading and leaving them both drained. The town seemed different in the late-night quiet, more intimate, as if disaster had stripped away pretense and left only truth. Mrs. Chen was waiting at their house with Annie, who flew into Clara's arms despite the blood and dirt. "Mrs. Chen told me what you did," Annie said, her voice muffled against Clara's shoulder. "You saved him." "Dr. Brennan saved him," Clara corrected. "I just helped." "That's not what the men are saying," Mrs. Chen interjected. "They're saying you were an angel in that mine, keeping that boy tethered to life with nothing but words and will." After Mrs. Chen left and Annie was tucked into bed, she'd insisted on sleeping in her own room now that Clara was back. Elias and Clara sat in the kitchen sharing a pot of coffee. Despite the late hour, both too wound up to sleep. "The town will see you differently now," Elias observed. "You're not just the abandoned bride anymore. You're the woman who went into a mine collapse to save one of their own." "I don't care how they see me," Clara said, though that wasn't entirely true. "I care that Timothy Watson will walk with a crutch, but walk down the aisle to marry Sarah Mills. I care that Annie can sleep knowing we're home. I care that you're looking at me like I'm something precious instead of problematic." "You are precious," Elias said simply, "and probably the least problematic thing that's happened to this family in years." Before Clara could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Mrs. Hawthorne, still in her nightrobe, her face flushed with excitement and something else, perhaps respect. "I'm sorry for the late hour," she said, though she didn't look sorry at all. But I had to tell you the town council met in emergency session. They want to officially commend you for your actions tonight. And, she paused dramatically, they want to offer you a position. A position? Clara asked, confused. As the town's auxiliary nurse, to assist Dr. Brennan when needed. It would be official with a small salary and the respect of the position. You'd be a proper member of the community, not just the sheriff's questionable house guest, Clara supplied dryly. Mrs. Hawthorne had the grace to blush. The council feels you've proven yourself tonight. Your father was a doctor. You have the knowledge, and God knows Dr. Brennan needs help. He's not as young as he used to be. I'll consider it, Clara said carefully. Thank you for bringing the message despite the hour. After Mrs. Hawthorne left, clearly disappointed not to get an immediate answer to fuel tomorrow's gossip, Elias laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. What's funny? Clara asked. You. 3 weeks ago you arrived as a scandal. Now they want to make you official town nurse. Only you could transform disaster into respectability so efficiently. It's a talent, Clara agreed, then sobered. Should I accept? Do you want to, I want to be useful. I want to belong here properly, not just as your… She paused, uncertain how to define what she was to him. As my what? He prompted, moving closer. I don't know, she admitted. What am I to you, Elias? He was quiet for a long moment, then stood and went to a drawer in the kitchen, pulling out something wrapped in faded silk. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a ring, not ornate, just a simple band with a small sapphire that caught the lamplight like captured sky. This was my grandmother's, he said quietly, not the one I gave Margaret that's buried with her. This one was kept for, I don't know, for someday, for possibility. He paused, turning the ring so it caught the light. You asked what you are to me. Your possibility, Clara. You're the future I didn't think I'd have. You're the mother Annie needs and the partner I never thought I'd want again. Clara's breath caught as he dropped to one knee right there in the kitchen, still dirty from the mine, exhausted from the night's events. I know it's too soon, he said. I know the town will say we're moving too fast, that I'm dishonoring Margaret's memory, that you're taking advantage. I know all the logical reasons to wait. But Clara, I've learned that logic doesn't always lead to life. Sometimes you have to choose the illogical thing, the thing that makes no sense except in your heart. Elias, marry me, he said simply. Not because it's proper or practical, not to silence gossip or give Annie a mother. Marry me because when you went down into that mine tonight, all I could think was that I hadn't told you I loved you yet. Marry me because you make me want to be more than functional. Marry me because spring is coming, and I want to plant a garden with you and watch things grow. Clara looked at this man who'd opened his door to a stranger, who'd let her burn a wedding dress in his kitchen, who'd stood by her in a courtroom and held lights while she helped save a life. She thought of Annie asleep upstairs, already calling her mother in unguarded moments. She thought of the house that was becoming home, the town that was slowly accepting her, the life they were building from the ashes of other plans. Yes, she said, not needing to think, not needing logic or time or propriety. Yes, of course, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her hand. Then he stood and kissed her, both of them covered in mine dust and exhaustion and joy. The town will have opinions, he warned when they broke apart. The town always has opinions. At least now they'll have something true to discuss. We should wait a few months to marry, he said, though his tone suggested he hated the idea. For appearance's sake. Or, Clara suggested, we could marry quietly, quickly, and let them figure it out later. I've already worn a wedding dress to this town once. I'd rather not make a second spectacle of it. Annie will be devastated if she can't be part of it. Then she'll be part of it. Her and whoever else actually matters to us. The rest can read about it in the newspaper. Elias laughed again, fuller this time. Margaret would have loved you. She always said I overthought everything, that sometimes the best decision was the fast one that felt right. Your Margaret was a wise woman. She was. And somehow I think she sent you to us. Not directly, but in that cosmic way where disasters lead to miracles. They stayed up until dawn planning a quiet wedding, a real life, a future neither had expected, but both now couldn't imagine living without. When Annie woke and found them still in the kitchen, the ring on Clara's finger, she simply nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Finally," she said. "I was beginning to think I'd have to propose for you. Can I be the flower girl?" "You can be whatever you want," Clara promised. "Then I want to be the one who gives you away," Annie said to Clara. "Since you don't have anyone else, and since I'm the one who decided to keep you." "You decided?" Elias asked, amused. "The moment she helped me burn that wedding dress," Annie said matter-of-factly, "I knew she was ours then." 3 days later, they married in the small chapel at sunrise, with only Annie, Dr. Brennan, Mrs. Chen, and surprisingly Mrs. Hawthorne as witnesses. Clara wore Margaret's best dress. Annie had insisted, saying her mother would want it to be part of something happy again. Elias wore his uncomfortable suit without complaint. Annie wore her mother's locket and a smile that could have lit the entire valley. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional. With one addition, Elias promised to always leave doors open for possibility, and Clara promised to always walk through them with courage. When the minister pronounced them married, Annie cheered loud enough to wake half the town, which was probably her intention. As they walked out of the chapel into the morning sun that was finally beginning to warm the valley toward spring, they found a crowd gathered, not hostile, but curious, perhaps even approving. Sarah Mills stood at the front, leaning heavily on Timothy Watson, who was upright on his new crutches. "Congratulations," Sarah called out, "and thank you." Others echoed the sentiment, and Clara realized that somewhere between arriving as an abandoned bride and standing here as Elias's wife, she'd become part of Frost Hollow's story. Not the part she'd expected, but perhaps the part she was always meant to play. "Ready for this?" Elias asked quietly, his hand finding hers. "With you always," Clara replied. They walked through the crowd together, Annie between them. No longer 3 separate people nursing wounds, but a family whole and healing, ready for whatever came next. Mrs. Hawthorne fell into step beside them as they headed home. "The council's offer stands," she said to Clara. "Auxiliary nurse. The position is yours if you want it." "I want it," Clara said without hesitation, "but I'll need supplies, proper equipment, and the authority to make decisions in emergencies." "Done," Mrs. Hawthorne said, then added with something like affection. "You know, Mrs. Turner, when you first arrived, I thought you'd be nothing but trouble." "I have been nothing but trouble," Clara pointed out. "Yes, but the good kind. The kind that wakes a town up, makes it reconsider things. Frost Hollow needed shaking, and you, my dear, are quite the earthquake." As they reached the house, their house now officially and completely, Elias carried Clara over the threshold while Annie applauded and laughed. Inside, the morning sun streamed through windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like celebration confetti. "Welcome home, Mrs. Turner," Elias said, setting her down gently. "I've been home since the moment you gave me coffee instead of judgment," Clara replied. "This is just making it official." Annie tugged at their joined hands. "Can we have breakfast now? Getting married makes me hungry." "Everything makes you hungry," Elias observed. "That's because I'm growing," Annie said with dignity. "And now that I have both parents again, I need extra energy for all the happiness." As Clara cooked breakfast, adding extra bacon because it was a celebration, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd boarded a train in Philadelphia as Clara Whitmore, desperate and alone, wearing a wedding dress for a man who didn't exist. She'd arrived in Frost Hollow, humiliated and abandoned. But somehow, through burned silk and French lessons, through mind collapses and courtroom testimonies, through apple turnovers and quiet evenings, she'd become Clara Turner, wife, mother, soon to be auxiliary nurse, and keeper of a house that was learning to be happy again. The wedding dress she'd burned had been for a fiction. But this life, this family, this unexpected love, this was real solid as the mountains surrounding Frost Hollow and twice as enduring. Outside, spring was finally beginning to assert itself, ice melting from roofs, the first brave flowers pushing through snow. Change was coming to Frost Hollow, and Clara Turner was ready to meet it hand in hand with the family she'd never expected but now couldn't imagine living without. The first weeks of marriage brought a rhythm Clara hadn't expected. Not the dramatic adjustment she'd feared, but a gentle settling like sediment finding its level in still water. She woke each morning to find Elias already gone to his early rounds, but his side of the bed still warm, a cup of coffee waiting on her nightstand, fixed exactly how she liked it. These small considerations spoke louder than any declaration telling her she was seen, known, valued in the quiet way that mattered most. Annie had taken to calling her mother, without hesitation, the word falling from her lips as naturally as if Clara had always been there. But it was the other moments that moved Clara most, when Annie unconsciously reached for her hand while walking, when she brought her small troubles and triumphs to Clara first, when she curled against her side during evening reading with the complete trust of a child who knew she was safe. 3 weeks into their marriage, Clara was organizing medical supplies in the small room Dr. Brennan had designated as her auxiliary nursing station when Timothy Watson hobbled in on his crutches, Sarah Mills at his side. "Mrs. Turner," Timothy began, then stopped, his young face flushing. "I never properly thanked you for what you did in the mine." "You were delirious from pain," Clara said gently, setting aside the bandages she'd been counting. "Thanks weren't necessary." "But they are," Sarah interjected. "You kept him fighting when he wanted to give up. The other miners, they talk about it still, how you went down into that darkness without hesitation." "Anyone would have—" "No," Timothy interrupted, with surprising firmness. "They wouldn't. And that's why we're here." He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "We want you to be there when we marry next month. Both of you, you and the sheriff, as witnesses. It seems right having the people who saved my life watch me start the rest of it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "We'd be honored." After they left, she stood in her small medical room, overwhelmed by how thoroughly she'd been woven into the fabric of this town. She'd come as an outsider, but somewhere between the trial and the mine collapse, between the quiet wedding and these daily interactions, she'd become essential to Frost Hollow's story. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Elias came home with an expression she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant trouble was brewing somewhere in town. "What is it?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "The Fletcher trial has stirred up problems," he said, hanging his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "2 more women have come forward, one from Boulder, one from Cheyenne. They want you to speak with them to tell them how you testified, how you survived." Clara's hand stilled on the bread she'd been slicing. "They're here in Frost Hollow. Arriving tomorrow on the afternoon train. I told them you might not want to relive it all, but I'll meet with them," Clara said firmly. "Of course I will. They need to know they're not alone in their humiliation." Annie, who'd been practicing piano, stopped playing and came to the kitchen doorway. "More women who were tricked." "Yes," Clara said simply. She'd learned that Annie preferred truth to comfortable fictions. "Will you help them be brave like you were?" "I'll try, though bravery looks different for everyone." "You should teach them the French insults," Annie suggested seriously. "It helps with feeling powerful." Despite the gravity of the situation, Elias laughed. "Our daughter's solution to all problems, French profanity." "Our daughter," Clara repeated softly, the words still feeling like a gift every time she heard them. The next afternoon, Clara met the 2 women in her parlor. Their parlor, she corrected herself, still adjusting to ownership of spaces that had belonged to another woman first. Martha Daniels from Boulder was older, perhaps 40, with the weathered look of someone who'd worked hard all her life, only to have her savings stolen by a beautiful fiction. Joan Harper from Cheyenne was younger, maybe 25, with the kind of desperate hope in her eyes that Clara recognized from her own mirror just months ago. "They say you got him convicted," Martha said without preamble. "That you didn't cry or beg, just spoke truth until the jury had no choice but to see him for what he was." "I had help," Clara said, pouring tea with hands that barely trembled. "A good prosecutor, other witnesses, and—" She paused, glancing toward the kitchen where Elias was teaching Annie to play chess, giving her privacy, but staying close enough if needed. "A family that stood by me." "You're lucky then," Joan said bitterly. "I've got nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. He took everything, even my dignity." "No," Clara said sharply, remembering Elias's coffee on that first awful morning. "He took your money and your trust. Dignity isn't something that can be stolen, only surrendered. And you're here, aren't you? Fighting back, that's dignity." "Easy for you to say," Martha observed, gesturing at the comfortable room. "You landed on your feet. Married the sheriff became the town nurse, a regular fairy tale ending. Clara set down her teacup with deliberate calm. Would you like to know what my fairy tale looked like? I burned my wedding dress in a stranger's kitchen while his grieving daughter watched. I faced a courtroom full of people who wanted to see me humiliated. I went down into a mind collapse, covered in another woman's dress because I had nothing of my own. Yes, I found love and purpose here, but not because I was lucky. Because I chose to build something from the wreckage instead of letting it bury me. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Joan asked in a small voice, How did you choose that when everything hurt so much? Clara moved to sit beside the younger woman, taking her hands. One day at a time. One small act of defiance at a time. You make breakfast even though you don't want to eat. You help someone else even though you need help yourself. You learn French curse words from an 8-year-old girl. That earned a watery smile. You stop waiting for rescue and become your own rescuer. I don't know if I'm strong enough, Joan whispered. Strength isn't something you have or don't have, Clara said, remembering Margaret's swing still hanging on the porch. It's something you build choice by choice, and the first choice is deciding you deserve better than what he tried to leave you with. They talked for 2 more hours, Clara sharing the practical details of testifying, the questions they'd face, the way Fletcher's attorney would try to twist their words. But more than that, she shared the harder truths, how anger could be fuel, how helping others could heal your own wounds, how love could grow in the most unexpected places if you were brave enough to let it. As the women prepared to leave, Martha paused at the door. You really love him, don't you, the sheriff? It's not just convenience or gratitude. Clara glanced toward the kitchen where Elias was now helping Annie with arithmetic, his patience infinite despite her dramatic complaints about the uselessness of long division. I love him more than I thought possible, not because he saved me, I saved myself, but because he saw me saving myself and stood beside me while I did it. After the women left, Clara found Elias in his study writing reports by lamplight. She slipped behind his chair, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Thank you, she murmured against his ear. For what? For knowing I needed to do that alone, but being close enough if I needed you. He pulled her around into his lap, studying her face. You helped them. I hope so. They're so lost, Elias, like I was. You were never lost, he said firmly. Misdirected maybe, but not lost. Lost people don't burn wedding dresses and make French-speaking insurgents out of grieving children. Before Clara could respond, Annie's voice carried from the doorway. Are you being romantic again? Because dinner's burning. Clara jumped up with a curse in English, not French, and ran to rescue the roast. As they sat down to a slightly charred dinner, Annie regaled them with gossip from school, including the news that Mrs. Patterson's niece was coming to town. She's supposed to be beautiful, Annie said with the disdain of a child who found beauty less interesting than intelligence. Mrs. Patterson's already talking about all the eligible men she'll introduce her to. Poor girl, Clara murmured, being paraded like cattle at auction. She mentioned you specifically, Annie added, looking at her father. Said it was a shame you were off the market just when her lovely Rebecca was arriving. Did she now? Elias's voice was dry as dust. I may have mentioned that father only likes women who can shoot curse in multiple languages and perform emergency medical procedures, Annie said innocently. She didn't seem pleased. Annie Turner. Clara tried to sound stern but failed entirely. You can't go around torpedoing potential romances. Why not? You torpedoed mine by marrying father before I could grow up and do it myself. Elias choked on his coffee while Clara stared at the child in shock. What? Annie said defensively. He's handsome, responsible, and makes excellent coffee. If you hadn't claimed him, I would have eventually. That's not how it works, Elias managed. I know that now, Annie said with exaggerated patience. But a girl can dream. Later that night, as Clara brushed out her hair before bed, she told Elias about Annie's declaration. He groaned, covering his face with his hands. She's 8. How does an 8-year-old even think such things? She reads Mrs. Patterson's romance novels, Clara reminded him. We should probably put a stop to that. Definitely. He paused. Though she's not wrong about the coffee. Clara threw a pillow at him, which led to him catching her around the waist, which led to the kind of romantic activities that definitely weren't in Mrs. Patterson's novels, or at least not in the parts appropriate for 8-year-olds. The next morning brought unexpected drama in the form of Mrs. Patterson herself arriving with her niece in tow. Rebecca Patterson was indeed beautiful. Golden hair, cornflower eyes, the kind of delicate features that inspired poetry. She was also, Clara realized, within 5 minutes, desperately unhappy. "I thought the sheriff might show Rebecca around town," Mrs. Patterson said willfully, ignoring Clara's presence in her own home, "since he knows everyone and everything." "How thoughtful," Clara said smoothly. "Though I'm afraid Elias is investigating a theft at the mining camp today. Perhaps Annie and I could show Miss Patterson around instead." Rebecca looked relieved at this suggestion, while her aunt appeared distinctly displeased. "That would be wonderful," Rebecca interrupted, showing the first sign of spine. "If it's not too much trouble, Mrs. Turner." As they walked through town, Annie chattering about various landmarks, Rebecca fell into step beside Clara. "I apologize for my aunt," she said quietly. "She means well, but she's determined to see me married within the year. And you're not interested in marriage." "I'm not interested in the kind of marriage she envisions," Rebecca corrected. "Convenient, practical, loveless. I'd rather be alone." "Sometimes the unexpected marriages are the best ones," Clara offered carefully. Rebecca studied her with intelligent eyes. "You mean yours?" "The whole town talks about it, the mail-order bride who married the sheriff within a month of arriving. They do love their gossip. They say you transformed him, that he was frozen with grief until you arrived." "We transformed each other," Clara corrected. "That's how real love works, mutual transformation, not one-sided rescue." Before Rebecca could respond, they heard shouting from the direction of the general store. A crowd had gathered, and at its center stood Jack Morrison, red-faced and drunk, despite the early hour, pointing an unsteady finger at Clara. "There she is," he slurred, "the woman who destroyed my marriage with her lies and implications." "Your drinking destroyed your marriage," someone called out, but Morrison ignored them. "You had no right," he continued, advancing on Clara. "No right to spread gossip about me when you're nothing but a fortune hunter who seduced a grieving man." Clara felt Annie tense beside her, ready to unleash French invectives, but she placed a calming hand on the child's shoulder. "Mr. Morrison, you're drunk and embarrassing yourself. Go home." "Don't tell me what to do, you—" Whatever insult he planned was cut short by Rebecca Patterson stepping forward. "Mr. Morrison, I presume. How fascinating to meet the man everyone whispers about. Tell me, is it true what they say about you and the miners' wives? Or should I ask Mrs. Patterson directly? She seems to know everything about everyone's business." Morrison paled, his attention diverted. "Who are you?" "Someone who recognizes a bully when she sees one," Rebecca said pleasantly. "And someone who has no patience for men who threaten women in the street. Sheriff Turner might arrest you for public drunkenness, but I'll make sure everyone from here to Denver knows exactly what kind of man you are. I have connections you can't imagine, Mr. Morrison." "Would you like to test them?" Morrison stumbled backward, then turned and fled, leaving the crowd murmuring with appreciation and surprise. "That was magnificent," Annie breathed. "Can you teach me to do that too?" "When you're older," Clara and Rebecca said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. As they continued their tour, Clara felt a kinship forming with this unexpected ally. Rebecca, it turned out, had come to Colorado not for marriage, but to escape an engagement her family had arranged in Boston. "I'm supposed to be visiting my dear aunt for my health," she explained. "In reality, I'm hiding until Frederick finds someone else to marry." "And your aunt doesn't know She thinks I'm pining for Frederick and need distraction, hence her matchmaking efforts." Rebecca sighed. "I should tell her the truth, but she's so excited about marrying me off to someone rugged and Western." That evening, Clara invited Rebecca to dinner partly from kindness and partly from curiosity. Elias was polite, but clearly uncomfortable with the beautiful stranger at his table, relaxing only when Clara caught his hand under the table and squeezed. "Miss Patterson," he said as Clara served dessert, "what are your plans while in Frost Hollow?" "I thought I might help at the school," Rebecca said. I have teaching experience, and Mrs. Chen mentioned they're overwhelmed with the miners' children. You want to teach miners' children? Annie asked, surprised. But you're fancy. Annie, Clara warned. It's all right. Rebecca laughed. I am fancy, I suppose. But fancy doesn't mean useless. I speak 4 languages, play 3 instruments, and can recite Shakespeare from memory. Surely some of that could benefit children who might not otherwise learn such things. Could you teach me piano? Annie asked eagerly. Mrs. Chen is lovely, but she only knows hymns and they're all boring. Annie Turner. Mrs. Chen is a perfectly good— I'd be happy to, Rebecca interrupted, if your parents agree. Clara and Elias exchanged glances, conducting the kind of wordless conversation married couples perfect over time. We'd pay you, of course, Elias said finally. Unnecessary. I'd welcome the distraction from my aunt's matrimonial campaigns. Over the next weeks, Rebecca became a regular presence in their home. She taught Annie piano with patience and humor, helped Clara with her growing medical practice, and gradually the town stopped seeing her as Mrs. Patterson's beautiful niece and started seeing her as Miss Rebecca, the teacher who'd somehow made Latin interesting to miners' sons. One evening, as Clara was reviewing patient files, Elias sat beside her, pulling her feet into his lap, a casual intimacy that still made her heart skip. You're matchmaking, he accused gently. I don't know what you mean. Rebecca and Dr. Brennan, you've invited them to dinner together 3 times this week. They have medical interests in common. Clara, she smiled unrepentant. He's lonely, she's brilliant, and they look at each other when they think no one's watching. Besides, it would infuriate Mrs. Patterson, which is reason enough. You're becoming quite the managing woman. I learned from the best. The town gossips taught me well. He pulled her closer, and she abandoned the files in favor of curling against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady, strong hers. I love you, he said, suddenly. The words still new enough to surprise them both. I love our life, our strange little family, the way you've made this house alive again. It was always alive, Clara corrected, just hibernating, waiting for spring. You are spring, he said against her hair. You brought it with you, even in the middle of winter. Before Clara could respond, Annie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown. I had a nightmare. Without hesitation, Clara opened her arms, and Annie climbed into their embrace, settling between them, with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. What did you dream? Elias asked. That mother, my first mother, came to visit, but it wasn't scary. She said she was happy we found each other. She said love multiplies, it doesn't divide. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. This child, wise beyond her years, had just voiced what they'd all been dancing around. That loving Clara didn't diminish Margaret's memory, that hearts could expand rather than replace. Your mother was very wise, Clara whispered. Both of them are, Annie corrected firmly, and that simple statement completed something in Clara she hadn't known was incomplete. The next morning brought chaos in the form of Timothy and Sarah's wedding. Despite it being a simple ceremony, the whole town turned out to celebrate the young couple who'd overcome such odds. Clara stood as witness, watching Timothy balance on his crutches as he slipped a ring onto Sarah's finger and thought about the strange paths that led to love. At the reception held in the church hall and featuring every cake and pie the town's women could produce, Rebecca caught the bouquet much to her aunt's delight and her own horror. It doesn't mean anything, she protested as Mrs. Patterson began listing eligible bachelors. But Clara noticed her glance toward Dr. Brennan, who was studiously examining his punch-glass ears pink with embarrassment. Dance with me, Elias said, pulling Clara onto the makeshift dance floor. There's no music yet. Then we'll make our own. They swayed together, ignoring the amused looks from other couples lost in their own world. Annie joined them standing on her father's feet as he waltzed them both around the floor. People are staring, Annie observed. Let them, Clara said. We're happy. That's worth staring at. The band finally started playing and other couples joined them. Clara saw Mrs. Hawthorne dancing with her husband, the Hartleys, attempting to dance while managing twins, and a baby Rebecca being led onto the floor by a blushing Dr. Brennan, while Mrs. Patterson looked on in shock. Look at what you've done, Elias murmured in her ear. What have I done? Brought this whole damn town back to life. Made us all remember that joy is possible after sorrow. That love comes in many forms. That sometimes the best families are the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. Clara looked around the room at Timothy and Sarah, radiating happiness, despite his missing leg, at Rebecca laughing at something Dr. Brennan said, at Annie teaching the Hartley twins French words they definitely shouldn't know, at Mrs. Hawthorne actually smiling as she watched the young couples dance. We did this, she corrected, all of us choosing to thaw instead of staying frozen. As the evening wore on and the dancing grew more enthusiastic, Clara stepped outside for air. The spring evening was soft with promise, the mountains' purple shadows against a star-filled sky. She thought about the woman who'd stood on a train platform in a wedding dress just months ago, desperate and alone, pinning her hopes on a beautiful fiction. That woman couldn't have imagined this standing outside a wedding reception as the town's auxiliary nurse, the sheriff's wife, a mother to a remarkable child surrounded by friends who'd started as gossips and become genuine connections. Elias found her there as she'd known he would. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. Regrets? He asked. Never. You, only one. She turned in his arms, concerned. What? That I can't go back and tell the man I was 14 months ago that this was possible. That grief wasn't the end but a transformation. That someone would come who wouldn't try to replace what was lost, but would help build something new alongside it. He wouldn't have believed you. No, Elias agreed. He needed to discover it for himself, with the help of a certain abandoned bride with a talent for French insults and apple turnovers. They stood together, watching stars appear, the sound of music and laughter drifting from the hall. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, patience to treat laws, to enforce a daughter, to raise a town to serve. There would be more gossip, more judgment, more tests of the life they were building. But tonight, Clara Turner stood in her husband's arms in a town that had become home and knew with bone-deep certainty that every wrong turn had been right, every disaster a doorway, every ending a beginning in disguise. Annie found them there, dragging Rebecca and Dr. Brennan with her. We're going to watch the stars, she announced. Dr. Brennan's going to teach us constellations. As the five of them stood in the Colorado nightheads, tilted back to the infinite sky, Clara felt the last of her old self slip away. Clara Whitmore, the desperate woman in the wedding dress, was truly gone. In her place stood Clara Turner, wife, mother, healer, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories were the ones that grew from the ashes of our carefully laid plans. Make a wish on the first star. Annie instructed them all. Clara closed her eyes but found she had nothing to wish for. Everything she needed was right here, the family she'd chosen, the town she'd claimed, the love she'd built from honesty and burnt silk, and the brave decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. What did you wish for? Annie asked her. For spring to last. Clara said, though, what she really meant was for this moment, this feeling, this unexpected perfect life to be real and lasting and hers. Spring doesn't last, Annie said practically, but it always comes back. That's better than lasting, it's renewable. Elias laughed, the sound rich and full in the mountain air. When did you become a philosopher? When you two started being so dramatic about everything, Annie retorted. Someone has to be sensible. As they walked back to the reception, Clara felt the truth of Annie's words settle into her bones. Spring didn't last, but it returned. Love wasn't permanent, but renewable, chosen again each morning, built fresh each day from small acts and large mercies. The music spilled out to meet them, and Clara let herself be pulled back into the dance, into the light, into the life she'd never planned but couldn't imagine living without. Around her, Frost Hollow celebrated not just Timothy and Sarah's wedding, but survival itself, the triumph of choosing joy after sorrow, connection after isolation, thaw after freeze. And at the center of it all, Clara Turner danced with her husband and daughter. No longer the abandoned bride, but the woman who'd taken abandonment and alchemized it into belonging, who'd proven that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with everything going wrong.